name is Jerry Zimmerman, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Federation of the Lehigh Valley. It is truly my privilege to welcome you to the JFLV Election Forum with Representative Susan Wild and Lisa Scheller, a historic moment for the Jewish people. In a few moments, we will have the opportunity to hear from both of them and topics that are relevant to our Jewish community and to answer questions that were submitted via email. But before we do that, I want to introduce our moderator for tonight, David Bernstein. David is the president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, where he represents our community, along with 125 other communities, on important issues at the national level. David has visited many of these communities throughout his tenure, including ours a few years back. But we are the first community that he is visiting during COVID-19 because of the historical importance of this race. Before his appointment, David served as a consultant dedicated to assisting organizations and communities in strengthening their Israel education, engagement, and advocacy work. He is also the founder of Culture Solutions, LLC, which works with nonprofits on strategic planning and culture change efforts. Welcome, David, and let's start the forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Good evening.
Good evening.
I am pleased to moderate this very important discussion about issues facing voters in the upcoming election for Pennsylvania's 7th Congressional District representing Lehigh Valley. I'm also pleased to be here live but safely social distanced, with Congresswoman Susan Wild, the Democratic incumbent, and Lisa Scheller, the Republican contender. This is an election of firsts. It is the first election in which the Democratic and Republican contestants for a congressional seat are both Jewish women. And I might add, both have been active supporters of the Jewish Federation. If I would have told my grandmother that someday I would be moderating a political forum between two Jewish women congressional candidates, she would have said in her heavy accent, "There's no way you'll ever moderate anything." I'm kidding. She would have not believed two Jewish women would have had the opportunity to run for Congress. What's more, she would not have believed that the fact that the two candidates are both Jewish would not have been an issue in this campaign, and it's not. But this puts an added layer of expectation on the discussion today. If we Jews truly aspire to be a light upon the nations, then our politics must reflect this and demonstrate the highest level of civil discourse. We're looking forward to such a discussion this evening. We know this is not the first forum the two of you have held on this race, highlighting many of the issues at stake. In this forum, we will focus on issues of concern to the Jewish community, some of which we've received in advance by email, but not only the Jewish community. So let's get started. 1 minute each, and we will start with you, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bernstein. And thank you to the Jewish Federation of the Lehigh Valley for hosting this event, and Shana Tova to all who are watching. Judaism has been a compass for my adult life. My children got their start in education right here in this building at the Allentown JCC. My son was bar mitzvahed at KI, and my daughter and I were bat mitzvahed together in Israel, together with some friends. Both of my children were lucky enough to go to Israel as part of the Birthright program. But this isn't just about showing our Jewish credentials. It's about living according to Jewish values. Tzedakah, if there is a needy person among you, do not harden your heart and shut your hand. Open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. And tikkun olam, the repair or perfection of the world. These are just two of the vital principles of the Jewish faith. In my first term in Congress, I have worked hard to advance those core values, putting the most vulnerable first, ensuring a livable planet, building a society in which we care for one another. But I also understand the teachings of Maimonides, that ongoing reliance on charity demoralizes the recipient. The emphasis must be upon lifting up the poor and helping them to find worthy, productive lives. As your Congresswoman, you don't ever have to worry about me wavering on these basic principles. I will always focus on bringing people together, not dividing them. Thank you.
Ms. Scheller.
Thank you. Shalom, Erev Tov L'Kulam. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share with you tonight my experience and my values. I'm an American, I'm a Jew, I'm a Zionist. I believe in the existence of Israel as a Jewish state and the unique relationship between America and Israel as beacons of light, hope, and freedom for all of the world. But it's more. We must support the American-Israel relationship, and it's a matter of life and death. Because there are regimes out there in this world that are hell-bent on wiping the Jewish people from the face of this earth. We also need to protect and be protected from anti-Semitism and hatred in our homes, in our religious institutions, on our campuses, everywhere. As your Congresswoman, I am going to work to protect our religious freedom, to secure and make safe our religious institutions, and to make sure that we all have the ability to live our lives free from the threat of harassment and anti-Semitism.
Great. Well, my first question was going to be, how does your Judaism animate your politics? But since you did such a beautiful job in your opening remarks with that, I think I'll get right down to the nitty-gritty. And my first question is about the special relationship between Israel and the United States. The U.S. has long maintained a strong alliance with Israel and a vital role in negotiating a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the past month, we have witnessed history as Israel has signed 2 peace agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. What role do you each see for the U.S. in helping to end the Israel-Palestinian conflict and creating peace with the Arab countries? Would you support legislation to advance Israeli-Palestinian coexistence, such as the Partnership for Fund for Peace Act? Ms. Scheller, why don't we start with you?
Well, thank you so much. I don't really think I talked about my life and growing up, so
spend a little time doing so, please.
I will spend a little time doing that. I grew up in a rural community, one of 2 Jewish families, and I had a good growing up, but I did experience anti-Semitism firsthand, having pennies thrown at me and being called Christ killer. So I grew up knowing that I was Jewish and what that meant. And I have always been involved in our community, whether it was through Federation of my Lion of Judah, family service, helping addicts get counseling that they need, or my long support of JDS and my children's participation there through 8th grade. You know, as Susan said, Tzedakah, it's been a driving force in my life and everything that I've done, and you'll hear more about that tonight. But I think I'm going to get to answering the question that you asked about the special relationship. I know it's a special relationship because you know what? When I think about the creation of Israel and the founding of our own country, I can't help think about the War of Independence and the shared values that gave birth to both of our countries. Both countries believe in liberty, democracy, human rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. And Israel is the only country in the Middle East that is like this. It is our closest ally. The fact that Israel, it's important to Pennsylvanians as well, the economic relationship that we share. In fact, I even have a relationship with the company Palram, which has locations in Israel and right here in our Lehigh Valley. You know, the U.S. and Israel face common enemies as well. And I believe that that alliance needs to be a strong alliance. When I look at the Abraham Accords, I can't help applaud what is going on in Israel right now in garnering people to get together, and enemies of to get together with the Arab nations are now coming together and normalizing economic relationships with Israel so that we can face that common enemy to both the United States and Israel, Iran. We need to continue to work on these relationships and build this normalization of economic trade within the Middle East. You know, that's why I'm really concerned when my opponent votes to defund our police and reduce our funding to our military, because we're looking at getting rid of our own senses of security. We're looking at changing our military because we need to be supportive of Israel and that special relationship in the Middle East.
Thank you. Congresswoman.
Thank you very much, David. First of all, let me just say I agree. Israel and the United States will always have a special relationship. We were the very first country to recognize Israel, and the strength and vitality of that country is essential not only to Israelis but also to us. It's essential to our national security in and around that region. And by the way, it is one of the principal reasons why I sought a seat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, on which I sit. I was honored to be asked by Chairman Elliot Engel and Representative Ted Deutsch, who actually grew up in our district, when they asked me to join that committee. And I was honored to accept, and I intend to stay on it next term. And the principal reason is that I have and will always use that seat to be a tireless advocate for Israel, as well as for our other important allies. So first and foremost, I want to say that I support a two-state solution. The United States has and must play an important role in any negotiations. I think it's in the best interests of all parties, including the United States, but I think it's very, very important that the United States act as a moderator. We need to negotiate and be a moderator from a position of strength, and use the strength that we have as the biggest supporter of Israel worldwide to help bring the parties to the table. I think it's really important to remember that although we recently saw some advances in terms of peace accords, that we continue to have concerns about some of the other countries, that are closer than UAE. And I really think that it's very important to make sure that all matters pertaining to Israel be not even a bipartisan issue, but a nonpartisan issue. I feel really strongly that the people recognize that the members of Congress on both sides of the aisle overwhelmingly support Israel, overwhelmingly want to see Israel safe and secure and succeed, and recognize that we have a wonderful relationship with Israel that is not just about security, although that is obviously the most important, but a very strong economic relationship with Israel.
Thank you. Okay, continuing, anti-Semitic violence and hate crimes have surged in recent years, and the Lehigh Valley has not been spared from that hate. Even during the pandemic, our community was targeted by an ugly Zoom bombing attack during religious services. We have also noted a rise in anti-Semitism on both sides of the ideological and political aisle. The boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, BDS, both on and off campus, have spawned virulent anti-Israel hatred, including calls for academic boycotts, and in many instances created a hostile environment for Jewish and pro-Israel students. Would you both support legislation to strengthen federal laws that combat hate groups, threats, attacks like the No Hate Act? Lisa, are you willing to condemn the Proud Boys and other white supremacy groups? And Congresswoman, are you willing to condemn anti-Semitism in the form of demonization of Israel in the BDS movement? Why don't we start there? We'll start with you, Congresswoman.
To answer your question, I absolutely do condemn anti-Semitism in the form of the BDS movement. I have voted on numerous bills and resolutions in Congress against the BDS movement. I think that it is very important to understand that global BDS does not support a two-state solution. It does not recognize, in fact, the right of the Jewish people to exist as a state. Many of the movement's leaders have trafficked in anti-Semitic tropes. So yes, I do condemn that. Anti-Semitism is a very serious concern to me. I have two children who are in their mid-20s. Both of them attended college, and I saw firsthand some of the efforts at anti-Semitism on those college campuses. And I think that it's something that we really have to combat at a very young age, and it has to be done at all levels. It has to be done in the schools. We must absolutely educate students about the Holocaust and everything that led up to it and what resulted thereafter. We have to make sure that our elected officials stand up as role models and that they combat hate not only with their words, but with their actions. We have seen an uptick in anti-Semitic acts. It's very, very concerning. And, I believe that white nationalism is the leading cause of violent political extremism. The guards at our synagogues they're not there to support us from BDS supporters, even though I do condemn that movement. They are there to protect us from the violent right-wing extremists who murdered Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue.
Ms. Scheller.
Hate is hate is hate. And so I find it interesting that you ask if Susan Wild condemns BDS and I condemn white supremacy. I don't care where hate comes from. I condemn it. I condemn white supremacy. I condemn BDS. You know, there's a saying, l'dor v'dor. We all know it is from generation to generation. And we think of it usually in fond terms as passing a Torah from a grandparent to a parent to a child during a bar or a bat mitzvah. I know anti-Semitism, l'dor v'dor. My father had his bar mitzvah at age 86 because had it been known that he was Jewish, my grandfather would have lost his job. I myself experienced anti-Semitism as a child, being called a Christ killer and having pennies thrown at me. And my daughter on her Georgia Tech campus, as she led a pro-Israel celebration, also experienced anti-Semitism. The biggest form of anti-Semitism is BDS, and it is economic warfare. It's economic warfare on Israel and on the Jews. I think, though, that these new peace accords are breaking through all of this. The problem on our campus right now are vocal radical groups that are drowning out Jewish voices and conservative voices. College admins are giving into it. They're not allowing certain speakers. They're allowing groups of people just shout down and make sure our speakers' voices can't be heard. And on our campuses, we need to stand up for this. We need to make sure that schools have some skin in the game, that they need to be held accountable, that everybody's freedom of speech is respected, and that any group can come and share what their feelings are. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe, you know, because I think Obama and Biden did nothing. They call our butcher attacks, the attacks on these butchers, they're called random. The truth is, these were hate crimes against Jews. Susan Wild doesn't stand up to anti-Semitism when it's coming from her own party. She didn't say anything about Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar until there was huge amounts of pressure on her. She claims to have admonished it in the privacy of her office, but that's not good enough. What am I doing? I founded the Woodman Scheller Graduate Program Studies in Israel, which offers master's and doctorate degrees located in Sde Boker, the retirement home and gravesite of David Ben-Gurion. Leaders from around the world come to learn the true story of Israel, not the media propaganda.
Great. I'm going to give you a chance to respond. Yes,
please, because my opponent misstates my record, which has happened before, and I think it's really important to note that a number of resolutions and bills have passed the House of Representatives condemning anti-Semitism and specifically condemning BDS. In fact, there was a Republican-led anti-BDS MTR, which is a procedural mechanism that I don't expect anybody to know what it is, but it is something that is attempted to be used to quash a bill. And although it failed because of the vast majority of Democrats voting against that MTR, I and 11 other Democrats voted in favor of it. That was in May 2019. I have also voted in favor of Chris Smith, the Republican on the Foreign Affairs Committee, his special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism act. That passed 411-1 in January of 2019. I have voted on Jamie Raskin's condemning anti-Semitism as hateful expressions of intolerance that are contradictory to the values and aspirations that define the people of the United States. That passed 407-23 in the House. This is the anti-hate resolution that occurred in March of 2019. And finally, I voted in favor of opposing efforts to delegitimize the State of Israel and the global BDS movement targeting Israel in July of 2019, as well as Congresswoman Maloney's Never Again Education Act signed into law in May 2020. So I reject my opponent's constant attempt to mischaracterize my record, and I remain firmly, very much in favor of Israel as a Jewish state, condemning anti-Semitism and the BDS movement.
Ms. Scheller, would you like to respond briefly?
So, Congresswoman Susan Wild says she is in favor of mandating a two-state solution. And in doing so, she is going to require Israel to negotiate with parties that have no respect for Israel, that in fact don't even believe that Israel has a right to exist. How are we going to prevent anti-Semitism and stand up to anti-Semitism in Israel when we are mandating Israel to negotiate with enemies?
All right, I think let's move on to another interesting topic, and that is COVID in our community. Income inequality in the U.S. has been a central issue throughout this election season, nationally, locally, especially as millions have lost their jobs and housing during this pandemic. What government policies do you believe can provide some measure of economic security and lift people out of poverty? Do you believe in a robust social safety net that ensures that everyone has access to affordable housing, nutritious food, quality health care, and good-paying jobs? What long-term reforms do you support to reduce income inequality in our country? And I know that health care has come up at the national level in the presidential debates. I hope you'll spend some time addressing that. Why don't we start with you, Ms. Scheller?
Well, that's a pretty broad question.
It is.
Because when I think about income equality, I think about the ability of people to get an education, and that education is going to help lift people out of poverty. The right education, the education that people need, not necessarily a 4-year degree where they're being loaded up with student debt or things like that, but maybe a 2-year degree, maybe a trade school, maybe a technical school. And what I've done within the community is I've helped those students get that education through millions of dollars that I have invested with, or actually donated, creating scholarships at L-Tri-C to help the most disadvantaged among our community. That's what's going to help get our people out of poverty, is the right education so they can have jobs. Now we need to have jobs for them to go to work to go to so that they can earn an income once they graduate. And to get jobs, right now we need to get beyond this COVID crisis, jumpstart our economy, get people back to work safely and quickly. And there's a lot to do with that. But what's going to bring people back and create a robust economy are the following things. And I know this because I have been a job creator all my life. I run a manufacturing company that employs 150 hardworking Pennsylvanians. What I'm talking about here is low taxes, reasonable regulations, good infrastructure, an educated workforce. These are things that are going to help bring businesses to the area, employ people, and raise everyone up out of poverty.
Great. Congresswoman.
Thank you. I want to start with the beginning of your question about COVID. I think we all want to see COVID in the rearview mirror. But we don't reopen and see our economy recover until we know that we are healthy and safe. And so one of the things that we have been trying so hard to get passed in Congress is vigorous, ample testing, funding for vaccinations, making sure that people have the kind of health care that they need, making sure that people's pre-existing conditions are not penalized if they have them. And I'm not just talking about heart disease and cancer and diabetes, all of which, of course, are pre-existing conditions, but anybody who has COVID, even a mild case of COVID, now has a pre-existing condition. And what I have seen throughout my time in Congress is my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, many of whom pledged in 2018 that they would never do anything to take away people's protection for pre-existing conditions, voting for things that actually would take away people's protection. We've got an appeal in the United States Supreme Court right now that this administration is perpetuating because of their interest in taking away people's coverage for pre-existing condition. None of that leads to a better outcome in these times of COVID. With regard to income inequality, there is no question that education is at the heart of it. It's one of the reasons that I chose, in addition to being on House Foreign Affairs, to be on the Education and Labor Committee, where I have worked relentlessly to make sure that our public school education is equal, is better, and that your zip code that you live in should not determine the quality of the education you get. It's one of the reasons why I was so thrilled and delighted after the passage of the first CARES Act to bring $10 million back to our district for the Allentown School District, where the students had not yet been able to get online for learning. They were about 2 weeks behind the suburban, more affluent school districts. Why? Because they didn't have the hardware, they didn't have the laptops, they didn't have the connectivity. And the money that I was able to bring back from Washington to the school district enabled the Allentown School District to make that happen. And education and equal health care is absolutely essential, among many other things, to curing the problem of income inequality.
Great. I want to stay with this for a bit. COVID-19 obviously has just dominated our national political discussion. It's something you're going to face in Congress in the coming weeks and months. And I wanted to give you a chance, Ms. Scheller, to go into that a bit. What do you think needs to be done nationally, locally, to make sure that this country is in a better place, both economically and in public health?
So I do agree that Americans do need more assistance to get beyond COVID-19. As a person who employs 150 hardworking Pennsylvanians in manufacturing, I felt firsthand what the COVID crisis did. Today, we operate our business. We wear masks, we follow the CDC guidelines. We wear masks, we socially distance, we use hand sanitizer, we clean frequently, and we're able to operate safely. We need to make sure that the rest of our Pennsylvania and our country gets back to work safely as well. With respect to health care, I believe that we need to have affordable and accessible health care. And again, I have provided health care for more than 150 hardworking Pennsylvanians and their family. To do this, we need more choices, not fewer choices. And I, for one, will not support a program that does not cover pre-existing conditions. Now, my opponent here, her way to get back for health care is Medicare for all. This is Bernie Sanders' socialist health care program that will cost $30 trillion, and even Sanders says it will double or triple our taxes, and everyone will have the same health care from the government. Now, while I say that, the problem is with that is that no one's going to have health care and it's not going to be affordable. And it's certainly going to not help our economy get back up and running. We need to have health care. That means, and there actually is a plan. We need to have lower drug prices through things like favored nation. We need to cover pre-existing conditions. We need to have more competition, because competition is what will lower prices. And we need to make sure that everyone can get health care that needs it.
Great. Congresswoman Wild.
So first, I just want to say that I think you're right. We're going to continue to be battling COVID and the fallout from COVID for some time to come. I think we're going to have to see specific targeted relief. I'll give you an example. I was a very early co-sponsor of something called the Restaurants Act, which is a long acronym for an act to bring specific relief to independently owned restaurants throughout our district and throughout the country. Why? Because they have been uniquely affected among small businesses in terms of how COVID has hit them. We all know about shutdowns. We all know that for a long time, people were not able to go into restaurants at all. Even now, it's a very limited number of people. We know that the winter months are coming and it's going to be cold. They're not going to be able to dine outside. So that's the kind of specific targeted relief that I think we have to see. And I'm not just talking about restaurants, but I do believe that we've got to look strategically at where the relief must go. Now, let me just say, my opponent talks about being a job creator, and I don't take that away from her. She has mentioned many times that she has provided jobs for 150 working Pennsylvanians, but I would also point out that my opponent should be happy to have their labor. A business does not function just because somebody owns a business. It functions and it succeeds because of the efforts of its workers. And so when my opponent speaks of healthcare as almost as though it's a gift that she has given to her workers, I would suggest to you that it's a benefit that they have earned by virtue of working for a business that has enabled my opponent to operate a company that has provided her with a very nice standard of living. And the last thing I want to say on this point, because once again, and I'm going to say it very directly, my opponent insists on saying that that my solution to what is wrong with healthcare in this country is Medicare for all. When I campaigned in 2018, I said to everybody I talked to that I would do whatever is needed to bring more healthcare at a more affordable price to more people. And so when I got to Congress, the first thing I did was I looked around for bills that specifically had to do with health care. Medicare for All is one of them. But I also have worked on many, many efforts to improve the ACA. I don't think we're anywhere close to Medicare for All. I had an amendment to the Protecting People with Pre-Existing Conditions Act last year that had 80 Republicans voting for it. So when I say to people that I'm going to work to bring you better health care at a more affordable price, I mean it. I'm going to work on all of those things at the same time.
1 minute rebuttal.
Sure. And that's why, Susan, you were a sponsor, an early sponsor of Medicare for All. We need more choices with our health care, not fewer choices. I am very proud, and again, yes, my employees, they do work hard, and it is a benefit, but it is a benefit over the years that it's cost more and more and more, and the reason for that is the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act has made insurance and providing health care more and more expensive. We do need to get more relief to people in need during this COVID crisis. And in fact, I do support a second round of PPP. PPP did not cover folks that worked in my nonprofit that most people don't know about. I've founded a nonprofit called Hope and Coffee that employs addicts in early recovery and helps get them back into the workforce. They did not receive assistance since they were a nonprofit. So we do need another round. And right now, I see that my opponent and her party and Nancy Pelosi had blocked that until they can get certain non-COVID related issues into that bill. Things like stimulus checks for illegal immigrants. Now, that is not going to help Americans get ahead. That is not going to give Americans what they need. That's not going to get us through this crisis. What we need is targeted help to those who really need it so we can get our country back up and running and back to work.
Okay, Congresswoman.
I find it interesting that my opponent is now a big fan of the ACA. She was endorsed by a president whose endorsement, by the way, she proudly touted until his polling numbers went into a tailspin.
You oppose the ACA.
I oppose the ACA.
All right, I thought you were talking about, but then I guess my question is, does my opponent, like the president, have no plan for what would replace the ACA? I mean, I haven't heard a plan
there is a
from
plan
any
out there.
Republican. I haven't heard a plan from anyone in Congress, and I certainly haven't heard my opponent's plan for what she would do if the ACA is taken away.
Would you like to comment on that, Ms. Scheller?
No.
Okay. All right. So
Can I take that to mean that my opponent has no plan?
No, you cannot take that to mean that.
ACA? Okay. Well, then it would be nice to have you share with us what your plan would be if the ACA is repealed.
Okay, we're going to stick to the framework here. Another issue that's come up, and it came up in the emails from some of the viewers this evening, is about the current moment in this country on race relations and civil rights. In the wake of the George Floyd killing, we've witnessed a racial and social justice movement come of age in Black Lives Matter. It has also spawned a counter movement and infused itself in our national discussion. Much of the Black Lives movement has been dedicated to re-envisioning the role of police in society. Some use the term defund the police. What are your views of this movement and its aims, both stated and implied? Why don't I start with you, Congresswoman Warren?
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that the Justice and Policing Act, which was passed by the House of Representatives after the murder of George Floyd, does not in any way call for defunding of the police. We have been very, very clear about that. The Congressional Black Caucus has been very, very clear that we do not call for defunding of the police. Having said that, I think it's really important for people to realize, and in the context especially of this forum where we are talking about anti-Semitism, among other things, that stoking prejudice against any kind of minority, Mexicans, Muslims, Africans, the LGBTQ population, any minority group, emboldens anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, it's not the AJDL for that very reason. So it's very important for us to understand as Jews and as people who care that there not be anti-Semitism or that people not be allowed to act on their anti-Semitic beliefs, that other people's lives matter also, that Black lives matter. That is a full sentence. And when I talk about what I think we need to do in order to assist in this effort in this country to bring us together and to make sure that we do curtail acts of police abuse, and by no means am I suggesting that most police officers fall into that category. I think it's really important for us to realize that we call upon our police in far too many instances. We have no mental health care support for most police departments in this country. It's one of the reasons I was so proud to introduce a bill earlier this year with Sherry Bustos of Illinois, which would provide funding for mobile mental health care units so that if somebody calls 911 and says, I've got somebody in my home that's looks like he's about to kill himself, that a mobile mental health care unit could be deployed along with a backup police officer. The police aren't the answer to everything. They don't even want to be the answer to everything. I assure you, I've worked with the police over the years. I was city solicitor in Allentown. I worked with the Allentown Police Department for a long time. I know what their concerns are. They are often called out on things that are simply not something that the police should be handling.
Great. Ms. Scheller?
So, I don't know what it feels like to be a black person living in America, but I do know what the sting of anti-Semitism feels like, as I've said. And to that I would say, I support black lives, period. All lives matter. I unequivocally denounce white supremacy. We need police. I'm a mom. I have two beautiful children. They're grown up now, but they weren't always grown up, and they'll always be my children, and I want them to be safe, and I want them to be secure, and I want to be safe and secure in my own home. And I want to make sure that when I pick up the phone, if I ever need help, and call for the police, that they are there to help me and my family, that they are not defunded. Now, my opponent, she says she does want to defund the police. In fact, not so long ago, when there were protests and people were out in the streets in crowds without masks in front of Allentown's police department, shouting, defund the police and F the police, she was giving them accolades, these protesters and the leaders of these protesters. And then she followed it up with action. She voted against qualified immunity for police, and just most recently in the latest version of the HEROES Act, she voted to reduce funding for law enforcement assistance by more than $600 million. And that makes me concerned about the security of my family and my home. I grew up in an America where we supported our police and we respected them and they were our friends, and I still do. Now, if there are problems, violence begets violence, and I do not support violent protesters. I do support peaceful protesters. But we need to make sure that we are a nation of laws and a nation of order. If our police need help in becoming better and helping our community in better ways, they should have more funding, not less funding. So I stand by our police, and I am very, very grateful to have the endorsements of the state troopers, the FOP with its over 40,000 members, and our State Troopers Association with its 9,000 members, the DA of Lehigh County, the DA of Monroe County, and numerous fraternal orders of police located in our district.
So I'm going to let you respond since she spoke to your record on that.
Sure, thank you. So the reference that was made to the recent COVID relief package was the HEROES 2.0, and I think it's worth pointing out. First of all, I did not vote for the first HEROES Act, which was passed at the end of May. I was one of only 14 Democrats to stand up to Democratic leadership and vote against the HEROES Act. And the reason I voted against it was because it was too big and it didn't do enough for my district. So the second HEROES Act, what we call HEROES 2.0 that we just voted on a week ago, was considerably trimmed down by $1.5 trillion, which meant that every single aspect of the original package had been reduced, including law enforcement. So the reduction that my opponent speaks of had to do with an overall trimming of the HEROES Act. With regard to qualified immunity, let me just say this. Nurses who go into a patient's room and harm a patient through their own negligence, Nurses don't get immunity. A truck driver who injures somebody on the road because of his negligence, he doesn't get immunity. Why would police officers be deserving of something that other workers are not deserving of? So I stand with the police. I stand with law enforcement. I am a big believer that we do need our police forces. I think that I frankly think that they deserve more money for training and making sure that we are providing the mental health support, both for as adjuncts, the mental health crisis units that I spoke of, as well as mental health care for them as well. But I don't believe that they should just have, unfettered rights that other workers do not have.
Right. So I'm going to ask the next question, which is a related question. And if you need extra time to respond to the Congresswoman, you can certainly take that. Jewish institutions have been targeted, as we've discussed during this discussion, by extremists. And we know that many institutions, including this JCC and many synagogues in the area, have had to add security to be safe and to protect the kids and the adults who come here. Would you support the expansion of the nonprofit security grant program that has gone through Congress and has afforded security to many institutions? But I would venture to guess that institutions in Allentown need more. Why don't we start with you, Ms. Scheller?
So I'd like to talk about security at our religious institutions, all of our religious institutions. Mm-hmm. And we do need to have physical security. How that's funded, there can be some discussion about that. But we do need to have police protecting us at our institutions. Now, in Israel, I've been in Israel for a long time. Wherever you go, you see soldiers, you see soldiers out there. Well, actually, let's talk about the security there. When you go into Israel, as many of us have, and we're very proud to do that, you go into a mall, you go through security. You go onto a train, you go through security. It's considered a part of life, a sense of security. I don't really think that, I don't want to have to feel like we have to have that kind of sense of security and that kind of normal here in the United States, because I want people to be comfortable. But we do need to have security at our religious institutions and other institutions. And so, you know what? Thank goodness we live in a country where we have the right to defend ourselves. The Tree of Life situation, it truly was tragic. The perpetrator that had already made threats, and it ended tragically. We need physical protection, whether inside of the institution or outside. I will tell you today, some of our thinking congregations and synagogues around the country, what they do is they actually have in-house security. They actually have congregants within the synagogue who are carrying concealed arms. Now, I don't know that it would have helped at Tree of Life, but I can imagine that if someone was there who could have defended the people from within the synagogue, it may have made a difference. Susan Wild again. She wants to take away money from our police, and I don't know where that's going to come, but she also does not support our right to carry concealed weapons, and she wants to take away our guns. I'm a mom. I want to make sure I can defend my family and my children and my home, and that's why it is so important that we maintain our Second Amendment rights as guaranteed in the Constitution.
Okay, Congresswoman Wild.
Thank you. We have to remember that an attack on worshipers of any faith is an attack on all of us, whether it's at the Tree of Life Synagogue or Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. In Congress, I have, in fact, supported robust funding for the nonprofit security grant program. It is a program that is administered by the Department of Homeland Security. It provides security funding to synagogues, mosques, and other at-risk places of worship and religious institutions. It's something that I've heard a great deal about from our synagogues and from our mosques in this district. But just recently, a Catholic church in downtown Allentown, one of their statues of the Virgin Mary was beheaded. I spoke out about that. As I said, I think that an attack on worshipers of any faith is an attack on all of us, and I think that we have to make absolutely certain that we are guarding against that. We had a hearing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee just recently where a witness discussed the money that some religious groups need to spend on security for their buildings and their temples. We know that mosques have been targets of violence and that Jewish temples worldwide have long been targets of violence. So I don't think that we have any choice, unfortunately, in today's world, but to provide that kind of robust funding that I spoke of before.
Great. I want to return to gun control because Ms. Scheller raised it, and I think it's an important issue for us all. But before that, in case you haven't noticed, there is a discussion about the Supreme Court going on, and we have a very respected and admired Supreme Court Justice in Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who left us, and now the seat is open once again. Do you support replacing that seat before the next president is elected? Why don't I start with you, Ms. Scheller?
Sure. Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she broke through the glass ceiling in so many aspects, and there's so much to be admired her for, both for women and for the Jewish people. And, you know, she should be honored and remembered and recorded in our history for this. But the president has been elected for a 4-year term, not a 3-year term, and it is the president's obligation, responsibility, to actually put forth a nomination for a Supreme Court justice. And it is the Senate's obligation and responsibility to vote on that nomination. I'm personally glad actually to see that the hearings for Judge Barrett have started so that this process can move forward in a timely manner, because we need to have a full court on our Supreme Court. This is an important role and an important part of our government. So I do believe that the filling of the seat should move forward, and I do believe that the Senate should vote on the nomination.
Okay. Congresswoman?
No, I do not believe the seat should be filled before the next president is selected. I think that it's both insulting and hypocritical. We all know what happened in the case of Merrick Garland, who was nominated by President Obama a full 10 months before the election, when the Senate, then led by Mitch McConnell, as now, refused to take up that nomination. I think that it is, quite frankly, reprehensible that a Senate that has not yet taken up a serious COVID relief package since May of this year is moving forward at lightning speed to confirm a Supreme Court nominee, while the American people are left wondering how they're going to pay their bills, how they're going to take care of their health care now that they've lost it if their employer-provided health care is no longer available. People who are wondering how they're going to manage to work while their children are going to school remotely. It's just reprehensible to me that the Senate has decided that this is their #1 priority. It is a power grab. It's clear that it's a power grab, and it shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Okay. Moving back to foreign policy for a moment here. Iran is no longer going to be entirely under the sanctions regime that it once was. It will be allowed to buy and sell arms again, and we are trying to figure out what to do next. What do you think our country should do next? Why don't I start with you, Congresswoman?
Well, I think the very first thing that everybody probably can agree on in this room is that the world and the region and Israel are all much safer places with a denuclearized Iran. I do believe that the recent situations and the escalating tension that we have had with Iran over the course of this year is a prime example of why it's necessary for Congress to reassert its authority in declaring war and acts of military aggression. The Middle East is rife with tension, and by killing one of Iran's top military officials, and don't get me wrong, General Soleimani was not a good person. He was a very bad person who was responsible for the murder of hundreds of U.S. forces and thousands of civilians, and I haven't wasted a moment mourning his death. But having said that, the tensions have been escalated, and I think it is very important that we return to a system of checks and balances, that the United States Congress reassert its authority on declaring war, and that we make sure that we don't have a chaotic, undisciplined policy towards Iran that sends mixed signals and raises the risk of miscalculation. I believe, quite frankly, that Iran is now closer to a nuclear weapon than it was when President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. Even strong opponents of the JCPOA, such as my colleagues, Chairman Elliot Engel and Representative Ted Deutsch, both of whom voted against the JCPOA, said that withdrawing with no credible plan B was a mistake. And we have yet to see what that plan B is. So I'm very, very concerned about the escalation of tensions, and I think that we absolutely need a foreign policy that is calculated and thoughtful.
Ms. Scheller.
Obama's plan with the JPCOA, the Iran deal, gave Iran a certain path to a nuclear weapon. And we're 5 years into it, and yes, they are definitely closer to having that nuclear weapon. They continue to enrich uranium. But they've also done something else. They have developed their missile technology, and they now have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach Europe and have the potential in the future to even reach the United States. So when they get that nuclear bomb ready, they have the means to take it to its target. And this is a threat for all of us. Now, Iran has proxies in the Middle East and Israel. And I'm going to tell you what I've done, because we do need, I do applaud getting out of the Iran nuclear deal. In fact, Chuck Schumer even voted against that deal. That's how bad it was. But I applaud that we are now out of it, because we can use economic sanctions against Iran to help get Iran back in line. What I did was in 2014, I was actually contacted by the U.S. Department of State. I was asked, and I know other people refused, at my own time and expense, to help seize and dispose of hundreds of thousands of pounds of aluminum powder that were being shipped illegally from China to Iran. They were going to be used as missile propellant. They were going to be used in IEDs. In 24 hours, I had Americans on the ground in Singapore. It took us 18 months to classify and to dispose of all of this aluminum powder. But you know what? It was going to Lebanon, to Hezbollah. It was going to Gaza, to Hamas, and it would have been used against Israelis and American interests in the area in the form of IEDs. You know, I'm a person who walks the talk, not just talks about what I'm going to do. What we need to do with Iran is make sure that the sanctions are in place that prevent it from ever having a nuclear weapon that can be used against Israelis, Jews, and Americans.
We've heard the phrase peaceful transition of power both in the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate. And that question was asked of both candidates in both debates. What is your view on a peaceful transition of power? And I start with you, Ms. Scheller.
I have no doubt that there's going to be a peaceful transition of power. I don't know why we're actually, questioning it here. My concern is actually with mail-in voting, and not so much the mail-in voting and the ability for people to mail-in vote, but that we have a free and a fair election, and that that every person in our country receives a vote, and one vote only, that only people who are U.S. citizens receive the ability to vote. And there are ways that we can do that. But right here in Pennsylvania's 7th District in our primary, there was a very significant issue, even during the primary, of the mail-in ballots, of them being so many that it completely overwhelmed our system and our ability to count those ballots. And that problem has now at least quadrupled for the general. So we may not know for days who actually won the election, and therein lies in that uncertainty and in what is going on. And there's a lot of confusion around this, that uncertainty into how we're actually going to determine who actually won the election. Now, one thing I do favor is voter ID, and that is something that my opponent says that she is opposed to. We need to make sure that the people who come to vote, whether by mail-in ballot or in person, are able to show who they are. And that has been a problem. You know, people need an ID to cash a check. They need an ID to get a prescription. They need an ID for almost everything. And government can provide that ID for free. I don't know why we don't have it here in Pennsylvania, and I would support that. But the transition is going to be, it will be peaceful, as it always has been. There may be a lot of shouting and screaming and people being angry, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is that we have a free and fair election. One person, one vote.
Great. Congresswoman Wild, I'd ask you to also address this issue of mail-in ballots that she raised as well.
Sure. I'd be happy to. First of all, I think that it was fortuitous that the Pennsylvania legislature just last year, in a Republican-led initiative, actually provided for mail-in, no excuse mail-in ballots. And interestingly, my opponent's own campaign encourages people to apply for mail-in ballots. So it's interesting that she seems to think that they're not such a great idea. I don't think, we know our president votes by mail. We know that most of the cabinet votes by mail. There is a different, I believe that everybody should only have one vote too, by the way. And I don't think that anything about mail-in ballots increases the likelihood of that not happening. You know, there's a different concept of ballot harvesting or sending ballots out widespread to people who haven't asked for them. In our country, and certainly in our state, you must register to vote. You must show an identification card when you register to vote. And then you are mailed a ballot, in this case, or in the past you've gone to the polls where your name's been looked up in the big polling books and a signature comparison is done. So I think that mail-in voting makes a lot of sense. It's happened in many states for many years, and it's done very, very successfully. And this year, in the middle of a pandemic, when we have senior citizens who are afraid to leave their homes for fear of contracting COVID, when we have people who with pre-existing conditions for the same reason are afraid to, I think that mail-in ballots make all the sense in the world. I also think that it's great that we now have several secure drop-off locations in different parts of each county so that people can take their own ballots in. And by the way, they can only take their own ballots in. They can't take somebody else's ballot in, which cures the concerns about ballot harvesting. The main thing that I think we have to remember is that voting is our most important democratic right. We should be making it more accessible to people, not more difficult for people. Finally, with regard to a peaceful transition of power, I certainly hope we have one at the end of in January. I was dismayed that Vice President Pence would not commit to a peaceful transition of power. I was frankly appalled to hear his silence on that. And we've never in our lifetime, never in the history of this country, have we seen anything other than a peaceful transition of power from one president to the next.
Ms. Scheller, I just wanted to ask you, you expressed some concern about mail-in ballots, but do you believe that they should be counted?
I don't have a problem with mail-in voting for the reasons that were stated. There are people who do not want to leave their homes, and that there are people who are not going to be in the area, people who are concerned. I don't have a problem with mail-in voting. My concern is, again, with the integrity of the vote counting and how it's going to be done. I personally know people who did not request ballots, and they have received ballots, multiple ballots in their homes, and we're looking into some of this. So there is a lot of confusion around it, and we want to make sure that the election is free and fair. And again, that the issue is not with the fact that you can mail in your ballot. But I also know that people are also bundling ballots and bringing them to the drop boxes as well. Which my opponent said is not happening. But I don't have an issue with the concept of mail-in voting.
Okay. So by far the most common question we received from the audience prior to this discussion was, who do you plan to vote for President of the United States? It's a personal question. You're free not to answer, but I'll pose it since it was asked so many times.
I'm happy and proud to say that I will be voting for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
I will be voting for President Donald J. Trump and Mike Pence.
Great. So I'm going to ask you each to give a 1-minute closing, and I'll start with Congresswoman Wild.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to the Jewish Federation for hosting this very, very important conversation. Not only do I appreciate the opportunity to have this kind of exchange, but I think these discussions are essential for voters to get to know the candidates who seek to represent them. It's important to remember that this election is not about me. It's not about my opponent. It's about you, your families, your community. I represent each and every one of you, regardless of the color of your skin, your religion, your ethnicity, or your party affiliation. In this election, protecting health care for millions of people is on the ballot. Bringing down prescription drug prices is on the ballot. Providing effective leadership to guide us out of this pandemic and economic crisis is on the ballot. Standing up for our values and against bigotry and hatred is on the ballot. I'm proud of what my office has done, but we have so much more to do. Together, I think that we can bring back all that we hold so dear in this country. I hope I have earned your support for a second term. Thank you.
Ms. Scheller.
Thank you. When you are deciding who you want to vote to be your voice in Washington, I ask you to consider the following. I have had a lifelong commitment to the Jewish community right here in Pennsylvania. My Lion of Judah is only the beginning. Having felt the sting of anti-Semitism myself personally, I will not tolerate it, not among my government peers, not anywhere in the world. I founded a graduate school in Israel that educates and creates pro-Israel leaders worldwide. I believe that the future of America, American Jews, and Israel lie in our ability to protect ourselves and defend ourselves against the common threat, Iran. My opponent, Susan Wild, she approves of this flawed Iranian nuclear deal, which almost certainly guarantees that Iran will have a nuclear weapon in the near future capable of destroying Israel and of ultimately targeting the United States. She did not show up at the embassy's inauguration in the capital of Israel, Jerusalem. Susan Wild votes to defund our police and defund our military, leaving us uncertain about the security of both our homes and our country. She voted to mandate a two-state solution, which forces Israel now to negotiate with enemies who don't believe in its right to exist. And Susan Wild doesn't stand up to her peers when they make the most egregious of anti-Semitic remarks, people like AOC and Ilhan Omar, and she chooses to remain silent. And we know what happens then. We have two resumes here. Who do you want to be your voice for Israel? Your voice for our religious institutions? For American security? I think that choice is clear. And so I ask you tonight to humbly support me on November 3rd with your vote. Thank you and good night. Toda rabah v'layla tov.
On behalf of the Jewish Federation of the Lehigh Valley, I want to first thank our candidates for a very thoughtful and civil discussion this evening. I want to thank our viewers for joining us, and have a great evening, and may I wish peaceful elections in this country in the days and weeks to come.
Thank you.